They told us we'd beg to come back. That was the threat. Canada, the 51st state, too weak to stand alone, too small to matter, too dependent to survive without American permission. The president said it out loud. His advisors repeated it. Their media amplified it. And for a moment, the world watched to see if we'd flinch. We didn't flinch. We didn't respond with threats of our own. We didn't tear up decades of cooperation out of spite. We just kept doing what Canada has always done. Stable governance, predictable policy, boring consistency. And then something remarkable happened. The world's largest automaker looked at North America and chose us. Not because we shouted the loudest, because we never had to shout at all. Volkswagen just canceled their American expansion and broke ground on a $7 billion battery plant in St. Thomas, Ontario. German investment in the United States collapsed by 45% in a single year. American manufacturing shed 59,000 jobs since spring. And those companies, those investments, those jobs, they didn't vanish into thin air. They crossed the border. They came north. Because it turns out, when you call someone your 51st state, when you threaten their sovereignty, when you make their economy a bargaining chip, you don't get compliance, you get competition. And Canada just won. Let me show you exactly how this happened. Because the story reveals something profound about what the world values now. It started with a single interview that nobody in America paid attention to. January 2026. Oliver Blume, CEO of Volkswagen, sits down with Handelsblatt, Germany's leading business newspaper. The reporter asks about North American expansion. Blume's answer is careful, measured, corporate. But buried in the diplomatic language is a bomb. Quote, "With unchanged tariff burdens and continued policy uncertainty, large additional investment cannot be funded at this time." Read that again. He's not saying investment is delayed. He's saying it cannot be funded. That's a German CEO, representing Europe's largest automaker, telling the world that building factories in America no longer makes financial sense. Not in 5 years, right now. The numbers behind that statement are staggering. In just 9 months of 2025, Volkswagen absorbed $2.5 billion in tariff losses on North American operations. Not over a decade, 9 months. That's $280 million evaporating every single month. Not invested in workers, not spent on equipment, not funding innovation, just gone. Burned paying penalties for the crime of trying to build cars across an increasingly hostile border. And here's what makes it worse. Modern automotive manufacturing isn't like the old days when you built everything in one place. A single vehicle in today's supply chain might cross the US-Canada border 6 or 7 times during production. Engine parts made in Michigan, assembled in Ontario, combined with transmissions from Ohio, final assembly back in Canada. Each crossing another tariff calculation. Each crossing another cost that didn't exist 2 years ago. The Audi factory they've been planning for the American South, the one that was supposed to employ thousands, it just disappeared from their capital allocation models. No press release, no apology, just silence. Because in corporate finance, you don't announce what you're not building. You just quietly redirect the capital somewhere that makes mathematical sense. And that somewhere was Canada. But this is bigger than one company's decision. Much bigger. The German Economic Institute just released data that should be front-page news everywhere. German investment in the United States dropped 45% year-over-year in 2025. Let me put that in context. Between February and November 2025, German firms invested 10.2 billion euros in America. The same period in 2024, they invested 18.9 billion euros. That's not a slowdown. That's not a correction. That's a collapse. Nearly 9 billion euros that was supposed to build American factories, employ American workers, generate American tax revenue, it just evaporated. And when German capital allocation committees canceled those American projects, the money didn't disappear. It moved. It flowed north. Because the question facing every major European manufacturer became brutally simple. Where do you build when America becomes unpredictable? The answer was even simpler. You build where things are stable. You build where governments honor their commitments. You build where trade policy doesn't change with the political wind. You build in Canada. Now let me explain why this is happening, because it reveals something fundamental about how global capital actually works. Imagine you're sitting on the investment committee at a major German manufacturer. Not Volkswagen, any of them. BMW, Mercedes, Siemens, BASF, doesn't matter. Your job is to allocate billions of euros across a 20-year time horizon. You build financial models, you forecast costs, you analyze political risk, you stress test scenarios. Here's what your model shows when you look at the United States in 2025. Year 1, January, 10% tariff on imported components. Okay, you can model that. It hurts your margins, but you adjust. Year 1, June, tariff jumps to 25% on the same components. You adjust again. Your supply chain costs explode, but you manage. Year 1, September, new sector-specific tariffs targeting your industry. Your competitors in other sectors aren't affected. Your cost structure is now fundamentally different from theirs. Year 2, tariffs partially reduced for countries that negotiate bilateral deals, but not for others. Now your competitors have different cost structures depending on where they're incorporated. And then in year 2, the president threatens to exit USMCA entirely. If that happens, everything resets. Every supply chain assumption you made, gone. Every cost model you built, worthless. This is what economists call unknowable costs. Not high costs, unknowable costs. And unknowable costs make any long-term industrial investment mathematically impossible to justify to your board. You can't forecast cash flows when you don't know what the tariff will be in month 7. You can't calculate return on investment when trade policy might fundamentally change next quarter. So what do? You never approve the American project. You don't make a dramatic announcement. You don't lay anyone off because nobody was hired yet. The factory just never gets built. The jobs just never exist. And in the quarterly report, there's a single line. North American expansion delayed pending clarity on trade framework. That's it. Billions of dollars of investment, thousands of jobs, decades of economic activity, all reduced to one euphemistic sentence. Now look at Canada through that same analytical lens. Same investment committee, same models, same 20-year forecast horizon. What do you see? Regulatory framework consistent over multiple electoral cycles. Trade agreements honored, regardless of which party holds power. Energy prices stable and predictable. Government incentives delivered exactly as promised, on schedule, no surprises. Environmental regulations clear and unlikely to change dramatically. Labor law stable. Currency policy boring. Nothing exciting, nothing dramatic, nothing that makes headlines, just predictable. And in the world of billion-dollar industrial investments that take decades to pay off, predictable beats exciting every single time. That's not weakness. That's exactly what capital is looking for. And it's paying off in ways most people don't see yet. Right now, as we speak, Volkswagen's PowerCo subsidiary is building what will become one of the largest battery cell manufacturing facilities on Earth. St. Thomas, Ontario. Not a concept, not a press release, actual construction. 90 gigawatt-hours of annual production capacity at full build-out. 3 massive factories on a 350-acre site. $7 billion in committed investment. In October 2025, they started pouring concrete. The foundation alone required over 500,000 square feet of formwork. They poured more than 32,000 cubic meters of concrete. Nearly 5,000 tons of reinforcing steel went into the ground. This isn't a photo opportunity. This is industrial infrastructure at a scale that will define Canadian manufacturing for the next 50 years. Production starts in 2027. When this plant reaches full capacity, it will produce enough battery cells every year to power 1 million electric vehicles. 1 million. Every single year. Frank Blome, PowerCo's CEO, said it directly in the press release. Quote, "Electric vehicles are the future of the global automotive sector, and we are proud to position Canada at the forefront of innovative EV battery production." Canada at the forefront. Not because we threatened anyone, not because we started a trade war, not because we called anyone names, because we showed up consistently, year after year, decade after decade, and did exactly what we said we would do. But here's where the story gets bigger than one factory, bigger than one company. This isn't an isolated decision. This is a fundamental reorientation of North American manufacturing. Between October 2021 and April 2024, automakers announced $46.1 billion in investments across Canada's EV supply chain. That number isn't a projection. It's not a political promise. That's verified by Canada's Parliamentary Budget Officer. Official count, binding commitments, capital already deployed or legally contracted. Honda building a massive EV assembly plant in Ontario. General Motors constructing a cathode manufacturing facility in Quebec, already 2/3 complete. Stellantis partnering with LG on a battery plant in Windsor that comes online this year. Ford expanding existing facilities to accommodate EV production. And it's not just the anchor manufacturers. The entire ecosystem is moving. Chemical processors are building plants near the battery factories to supply specialized materials. Component manufacturers are relocating to be closer to final assembly. Logistics firms are expanding warehouses and distribution networks. Engineering firms are opening Canadian offices. Research partnerships are forming between manufacturers and Canadian universities. This isn't a factory. This is an industrial ecosystem. And ecosystems, once established, don't move back easily. Here's what that means in practical terms. Every $1 billion invested in advanced manufacturing creates ripple effects through the entire economy. Construction jobs building the facilities, engineering positions designing the production lines, logistics networks moving materials and finished products, service industries supporting the workers, housing developments for the families, university research programs aligned with industry needs. These aren't temporary construction jobs that disappear when the building is finished. These are careers. 30-year mortgages getting approved in Windsor and St. Thomas. Pension funds receiving contributions that will pay out for decades. Tax revenues funding schools and hospitals across Ontario and Quebec. Kids growing up in communities that exist because their parents build batteries for electric vehicles. This is what stability buys you, not just jobs. Generational economic foundation. While Washington burned through political capital threatening trade wars and calling allies names, Canada was building physical capital that will generate returns for the next half-century. That's not luck. That's not subsidy competition. That's the reward for doing things the boring way, for honoring your commitments, for being predictable. And here's what makes this shift potentially permanent. Economists have a term for it: path dependency. Once a major industrial investment gets made in one location instead of another, it doesn't just bring jobs to that location. It fundamentally alters the economic geography of everything that follows. When Volkswagen builds that battery plant in Ontario instead of Ohio, something profound happens. Suppliers relocate to serve the plant because proximity matters in manufacturing. They build their own facilities nearby. Universities notice the cluster forming and align their engineering programs to train workers with the specific skills these manufacturers need. Research funding follows the industry concentration. Provincial governments invest in infrastructure, roads, rail, utilities, to support the cluster. Workers relocate to take jobs at the plant. They buy homes. Their kids enroll in local schools. Housing developments spring up. Retail follows the population. And then the ecosystem becomes self-reinforcing. It generates its own gravitational pull. The next company looking to build a battery plant sees that Ontario already has the suppliers, the trained workforce, the logistics infrastructure, the research partnerships. So they build there too. And the cluster grows. And the ecosystem deepens. The suppliers who relocated to serve those battery plants, they're not moving back. They just spent hundreds of millions building facilities optimized for Canadian operations. The engineers who took jobs in St. Thomas and Windsor, they're buying houses. Their kids are making friends. They're building lives. The universities that align their programs with Canadian EV manufacturing, they're training the next generation for Canadian factories, not American ones. This is how industrial geography shifts, slowly, then suddenly, and almost always permanently. Capital responds to track records, not promises. After years of policy chaos and broken commitments, global firms have quietly reclassified the United States from a low-risk anchor market to a high-risk variable market. That classification doesn't appear in any press release, but it shows up in every investment committee meeting, in every capital allocation model, in every long-term strategic plan. And that reclassification takes years, maybe decades of sustained stability to reverse. In the meantime, Canada consolidates. Every factory that gets built here instead of there makes the next factory more likely to be built here too. Every $1 billion invested strengthens the case for the next billion. Every trained worker makes the workforce more attractive. Every supplier that relocates makes the ecosystem more complete. This is economic momentum, and right now, it's flowing north. Here's what I think is the most important part of this story, the part that explains why this happened and why it matters. The American approach to Canada was based on one fundamental assumption, that Canada needs the United States more than the United States needs Canada. That we're so small, so dependent, so intertwined, that any serious pressure would force immediate compliance. The president called us the 51st state to reinforce that message. You're not really sovereign. You're not really independent. You're basically part of us. You just don't admit it yet. The threats followed naturally from that assumption. Tariffs to force renegotiation, trade pressure to extract concessions, public humiliation to demonstrate dominance. They assumed we'd panic. They assumed we'd beg. They assumed we'd fold. We didn't panic. We didn't beg. We didn't fold. We just kept building. And every single threat gave Canadian political leaders more domestic support for investing in alternatives to American supply chains. Because when someone tells you that you're not really independent, you prove them wrong. When someone threatens your sovereignty, you defend it. When someone tries to use economic coercion, you build economic resilience. The Bureau of Labor Statistics shows American manufacturing employment declined by 59,000 jobs since April 2025. Read that number again. 59,000 American manufacturing jobs lost. Those were supposed to be the jobs that tariffs would protect. Those were supposed to be the jobs that aggressive trade policy would bring back. Instead, many of them are being created right now in Canadian facilities, paying Canadian workers, contributing to Canadian pension plans, generating Canadian tax revenue, funding Canadian schools and hospitals. The factories being built on Canadian soil today are the dividends of patience, of not retaliating when threatened, of not matching chaos with chaos, of just staying the course while others burn their credibility. And long after the political noise fades, long after this administration is a footnote in history books, those factories will still be here, still producing, still employing, still generating wealth. Because infrastructure outlasts politics, supply chains outlast presidents, and economic momentum, once established, is extraordinarily difficult to reverse. Markets once lost stay lost. Supply chains don't wait for political stability to return. And you don't get a second chance to be the stable option when capital is making 20-year decisions. So let me bring this home because I think we're watching something historically significant unfold. For decades, Canada operated under a simple assumption. We were the junior partner in North American economics. Smaller economy, smaller population, dependent on American markets, vulnerable to American pressure. And maybe there was a time when that felt true. Maybe there was a time when that was true. But something fundamental shifted. Not because Canada became aggressive. Not because we started our own trade war. Not because we threatened anyone. Not because we shouted louder than anyone else. We just kept doing what we've always done. We honored our trade agreements even when others didn't. We maintained our institutions even when it wasn't dramatic. We stayed predictable even when chaos was fashionable. We kept building even when we were told we'd fail without permission. And when the world started looking for stability, real stability, demonstrated stability, not promised stability, they found us. Volkswagen found us. $7 billion found us. German investors found us, while their American investments collapsed by half. The entire EV supply chain found us. $46 billion in committed investment found us. They didn't come here because we offered the biggest subsidies. They didn't come here because we were cheapest. They came here because we offered something that's become extraordinarily rare in the modern world: Certainty. The ability to make a 20-year investment decision and have confidence that the rules won't fundamentally change in year 3. The knowledge that trade agreements will be honored regardless of electoral outcomes. The boring, unglamorous, deeply valuable quality of predictability. Here's what this means going forward. For the next 50 years, the infrastructure being built right now in St. Thomas, in Windsor, in Quebec, will outlast every politician currently in office on either side of the border. The factories under construction will still be producing when today's trade disputes are forgotten. The jobs being created today will become careers that last decades. Those careers will become communities with schools and hospitals and libraries. Those communities will become the foundation of Canadian manufacturing for generations. This isn't a political victory that gets reversed in the next election. This is economic infrastructure. This is physical capital. This is the kind of change that persists regardless of who wins what election. And it was built the Canadian way. Not by imitating the chaos around us, not by threatening others, not by breaking commitments to prove strength, by staying true to who we've always been. Stable, predictable, boring. They said we were the 51st state. They said we couldn't survive without them. They said we'd come crawling back the moment things got difficult. They were wrong. We didn't need to become the 51st state. We just needed to be Canada. And it turns out, the world needed what we had all along. Stability, consistency, reliability. The boring virtues that don't make dramatic headlines, but do make 20-year investment decisions possible. Those virtues are worth more than $20 billion. They're worth more than any tariff. They're worth more than any threat. Because they're the foundation of trust. And trust is what capital follows. So I'm genuinely curious what you think about this moment. Is this the beginning of something permanent? A fundamental reorientation of North American manufacturing that will persist for decades? Or can the relationship be rebuilt? Can America restore the predictability that global capital demands? What am I missing in this analysis? Because right now, watching German capital flow north while American factories close, it feels like we're witnessing a turning point, and I'm not sure everyone realizes it yet.